Richmond Palace sat beneath the dim light of a late March morning in 1603, its corridors quieter than usual as courtiers, councillors, physicians, and messengers waited for news that could end one of the most consequential royal dynasties in English history. Queen Elizabeth I was 69 years old. She had ruled for more than 44 years, survived religious conflict, dynastic conspiracies, war with Spain, rebellion in Ireland, and repeated pressure to marry, yet she had produced no direct heir. Beyond the palace walls, arrangements for succession had been discussed with great caution for years, but there was no simple public declaration that removed every uncertainty.
Before dawn.
Somewhere north of the border, James VI of Scotland stood as the strongest claimant to inherit the English crown. The approaching transfer would be peaceful by the standards of Tudor politics, but it would also mark something extraordinary. A royal house born in battle in 1485 was about to vanish from the direct line after only 5 Tudor monarchs. How had a dynasty created amid the violence of the Wars of the Roses transformed the monarchy, religion, royal administration, parliament, Wales, maritime power, and England's position in Europe, only to disappear little more than a century later? And why did so many of the forces that made the Tudors stronger also generate the crises that repeatedly threatened to destroy them? The answer begins long before Elizabeth's final days. It begins with a disputed crown, exhausted noble factions, and a battlefield at Bosworth in August 1485, where Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and turned a fragile Lancastrian claim into the foundation of a new ruling house. Henry VII would spend the next 24 years converting military victory into political survival. He would use marriage, parliament, royal councils, financial controls, bonds, recognizances, diplomacy, and carefully managed dynastic symbolism to stabilize a monarchy that could not assume its legitimacy was secure. Challenges from Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck would remind the new king that the memory of Plantagenet succession remained dangerous, and that possession of the throne was not the same thing as uncontested acceptance. His son, Henry VIII, would inherit a far more stable crown in 1509, yet his reign would transform the Tudor monarchy in ways his father could not have predicted. The succession problem that emerged from Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon would become more than a private dynastic concern. The king's great matter would collide with papal jurisdiction, European diplomacy, theology, inheritance law, and the question of whether the English crown could define the limits of external authority within its own realm. The resulting break with Rome would reshape the relationship between monarchy, church, parliament, property, and political obedience. The Act in Restraint of Appeals of 1533 and the Act of Supremacy of 1534 would become central markers of that transformation, while the dissolution of the monasteries would redistribute wealth and alter landscapes, institutions, communities, and patronage across England and Wales. Court politics would become inseparable from dynastic strategy. Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, the changing fortunes of ministers such as Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Cranmer, and Henry VIII's successive marriages would later be remembered through stories of ambition, betrayal, and execution. Some of those stories rest securely on statutes, letters, financial records, diplomatic reports, and trial documents. Others were shaped by hostile observers, political propaganda, later chronicles, and centuries of retelling. That distinction matters. Blood, betrayal, is a powerful description of recurring Tudor conflict, but it does not mean that every reign or every political decision was defined by murder and treachery. The dynasty also governed through law, administration, negotiation, patronage, taxation, religious policy, local institutions, and the ordinary machinery of monarchy. Nor did the Tudor transformation stop at the English Church. The Laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542 brought Wales more closely into the English legal and administrative system, expanding the reach of royal institutions while also imposing English legal forms in ways whose consequences extended far beyond Henry VIII's reign. Yet even this development must be described carefully. The Tudors did not create the Kingdom of Great Britain. That political union would not exist until 1707. The phrase, "the monarchy that forged Britain," is therefore historical shorthand, not a literal claim. Tudor centralization, Reformation politics, the closer legal integration of Wales, the the growing role of Parliament in major constitutional change, conflict and negotiation with Scotland and Ireland, maritime expansion, and the cross-border succession of 1603 helped create institutions and tensions that later became part of British state formation. They did not single-handedly create Britain, parliamentary democracy, the British Empire, or a modern nation-state. After Henry VIII, the monarchy entered a period in which religion and succession became even more tightly connected. Edward VI's governments pushed Protestant reform further, while social and religious tensions erupted in the rebellions of 1549. When Edward died in 1553, an attempt to alter the succession produced one of the most dramatic legitimacy crises of the dynasty. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, but Mary Tudor gathered sufficient support to take the throne and restore the succession established through Henry VIII's daughters. Mary I then sought to restore papal communion and Catholic worship, faced Wyatt's rebellion, married Philip of Spain, and revived heresy prosecutions that would become central to her posthumous reputation. The surviving record, however, requires the same caution demanded elsewhere in Tudor history. Later Protestant memory, political polemic, and subsequent national mythology often shaped how her reign was remembered. Elizabeth's accession in 1558 did not erase these tensions. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 created a Protestant framework under royal supremacy, but confessional disagreement remained politically dangerous. Mary Queen of Scots became both a dynastic claimant and a focus for Catholic opposition. Elizabeth's excommunication by Pope Pius V in 1570 intensified the political significance of loyalty and religion. Plots against the crown brought intelligence networks under Francis Walsingham into increasingly important roles, and Mary's execution in 1587 demonstrated how succession, security, religion, and monarchy could converge in a single crisis. A year later, the Spanish Armada placed England inside a wider European struggle involving religion, dynastic rivalry, naval strategy, commerce, and war. The Armada's defeat became one of the defining legends of Elizabeth's reign, but even here the evidence is more complex than national mythology. English naval action mattered, Spanish logistical problems mattered, weather mattered, and the broader war with Spain continued long after 1588. Meanwhile, maritime raiding, exploration, commercial experimentation, and ventures overseas began to change English horizons. The chartering of the East India Company in 1600 would later acquire enormous significance, but it should not be mistaken for the instant creation of a global empire. In Ireland, the 9 Years' War exposed the severe limits of Tudor authority and the costs of attempting to impose political control across territories with different social structures, loyalties, and traditions. At home, inflation, poverty, population growth, enclosure pressures, harvest difficulties, and labor insecurity created social tensions that royal imagery could not conceal. The poor laws developed in response to some of these pressures, while the monarchy relied increasingly on print, portraiture, pageantry, progresses, and carefully constructed representations of royal authority. Elizabeth herself became one of the most powerful political images of the age, but the image of stability masked one unresolved dynastic problem that had followed the Tudors from Bosworth onward: succession. She never married. She had no child. And as her final illness advanced at Richmond Palace in March 1603, the dynasty confronted the same basic question that had shaped so much of its history: who would possess the crown when the reigning monarch could no longer hold it? Contemporary accounts differ in detail about Elizabeth's final days, and the record does not establish with certainty every gesture, exchange, or supposed nomination later attributed to her. What is clear is that political preparation had already made James VI of Scotland the leading successor, and when Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, he became James I of England. The Tudor dynasty ended without a new battle for the crown, but its disappearance did not erase what it had changed. To understand how England reached that moment, the story must return to 1485, to a field near Bosworth, where a claimant with a vulnerable bloodline defeated a king and began a dynasty whose greatest strength and greatest weakness would always be the same thing: the crown had to be secured again with every generation. In 1485, the English crown was not simply a prize waiting for the strongest claimant to seize it. It was an institution weakened by decades of dynastic conflict, disputed inheritance, noble rivalry, changing political loyalties, and the repeated removal of kings during what later became known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor entered this struggle with a claim that was real but politically vulnerable. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a son of Edward III, through the Beaufort line, whose descendants had originally been born outside marriage before later legitimization. Their right to inherit the crown had been restricted under Henry IV, making Henry Tudor's hereditary position less straightforward than later Tudor propaganda sometimes implied. His significance came not only from blood, but from circumstance.
For the sake of
By the
England.
early 1480s, after years spent largely in exile in Brittany and France, he had become a rallying point for opponents of Richard III and for those who believed a change of dynasty could restore political stability. Henry had survived repeated efforts to remove him from continental refuge, negotiated with supporters inside England, and promised to marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, thereby offering the possibility of reconciling elements associated with Lancaster and York. Yet promises made in exile were not guarantees of victory. When Henry landed in Wales in August 1485, his invading force was relatively small, and his march toward Richard III depended upon uncertain alliances, local support, and the decisions of powerful nobles whose loyalty could not be assumed. On August 22, the two armies met near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Later chronicles provide vivid descriptions of the Battle of Bosworth Field, but the precise sequence of every movement remains debated, and the battlefield should not be reconstructed with more confidence than the surviving evidence permits. Richard III personally entered the fighting and was killed during the battle. The intervention, hesitation, or shifting allegiance of forces associated with the Stanley family played an important role in the outcome, although later retellings have sometimes simplified a fluid political and military situation into a perfectly staged betrayal. Henry survived, Richard was defeated, and the crown passed to a new claimant whose dynasty did not yet exist as a secure political fact. Henry dated the beginning of his reign to August 21, the day before Bosworth, an important legal maneuver that allowed those who had fought against him under Richard to be treated as having acted against the reigning king. He was crowned Henry VII at Westminster Abbey on October 30, 1485, before marrying Elizabeth of York. That order mattered. Henry intended his kingship to rest on conquest, parliamentary recognition, heredity, and divine legitimacy rather than appear dependent entirely upon his wife's stronger Yorkist bloodline. Parliament recognized his title, and in January 1486 he married Elizabeth. The union became one of the most powerful symbols of the new regime. Tudor imagery later fused the red rose associated with Lancaster and the white rose associated with York into the Tudor rose, presenting the marriage as the healing of dynastic division. Symbolism, however, could not eliminate rival claims. The first serious challenge appeared in 1487 around Lambert Simnel, a boy presented by conspirators as Edward, Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist claimant who was actually imprisoned by Henry. Simnel was crowned in Dublin by supporters, and an invading force landed in England before being defeated at the Battle of Stoke Field. Henry survived the challenge, but the episode demonstrated how quickly a rival identity could attract political backing. An even more persistent threat emerged in the 1490s when Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the sons of Edward IV whose disappearance had become one of the unresolved mysteries of the previous reign. Warbeck gained recognition or assistance at different times from rulers and factions outside England, including Margaret of Burgundy, James IV of Scotland, and others willing to use the claimant as leverage against Henry. His challenge ultimately failed, but it forced the Tudor regime to combine diplomacy, intelligence, military preparation, and political punishment over several years. Henry's response to such threats helped shape his reputation as a cautious and controlling ruler. Attainders could strip political enemies of property and status, while bonds and recognizances imposed financial obligations intended to guarantee future conduct. Royal councils, legal mechanisms, household administration, and increasingly careful financial supervision strengthened the crown's ability to discipline powerful subjects. Historians continue to debate how innovative these methods truly were. Many had medieval precedents, and Henry did not invent centralized government from nothing, but he used existing tools with notable persistence in an environment where dynastic loyalty remained uncertain. Parliament remained necessary for legislation, taxation, attainders, reversals of attainder, and political legitimacy, while the monarchy continued to depend on nobles, gentry, sheriffs, justices of the peace, and local officeholders to govern communities far from Westminster. Henry therefore faced a contradiction that would remain fundamental throughout Tudor rule. Stronger kingship required control, but control itself depended upon cooperation from subjects and institutions the crown could not simply replace. Financial recovery was equally important. Civil conflict had damaged royal authority, and Henry worked to restore income from crown lands, customs, feudal rights, fines, and other traditional sources. His methods could create resentment, particularly late in the reign, but they helped leave the monarchy financially stronger than it had been at his accession. Diplomacy reinforced this reconstruction. Rather than relying entirely on war, Henry used treaties and marriage alliances to position the new dynasty within European politics. His children became instruments of that strategy, but also reminders that the future of the monarchy depended on biology. His eldest son, Arthur, was born in 1486 and was named in a way that connected the dynasty to legendary British kingship. Margaret followed in 1489, Henry in 1491, and Mary in 1496. Other children did not survive long enough to shape the succession. Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, in 1501, linking the Tudors to one of Europe's most prestigious royal houses. His death in 1502 suddenly transferred the weight of dynastic expectation to his younger brother Henry. Margaret Tudor's marriage to James IV of Scotland in 1503 had consequences that would reach even farther into the future. At the time, it was intended to strengthen relations between England and Scotland. A century later, Margaret's descendants would provide the dynastic bridge through which James VI of Scotland could inherit the English throne after Elizabeth I died without children. Henry VII could not know the exact importance that marriage would acquire, but it demonstrated the long reach of dynastic diplomacy. By the final years of his reign, the crown was more secure than it had been after Bosworth, but England had not suddenly become peaceful, centralized, or modern. Regional power remained important, social tensions persisted, taxation could provoke resistance, and foreign policy still depended upon a changing European balance. Above all, the Tudor future remained tied to the uncertain survival of heirs. Elizabeth of York died in 1503, and Henry VII himself died on April 21, 1509. The throne passed without serious resistance to his surviving son, 17-year-old Henry VIII. The young king inherited something his father had never possessed in 1485, Arthur, a recognized dynasty, substantial royal resources, and a crown whose legitimacy appeared comparatively secure. Yet that security carried its own expectation. The dynasty now needed to reproduce itself. Henry VIII would inherit the kingdom his father had stabilized, but his ambitions, his marriages, and his increasingly urgent need for a male successor would transform the monarchy more radically than Henry VII could have foreseen. When Henry VIII inherited the English throne in April 1509, he did not inherit the same political uncertainty that had surrounded his father after Bosworth. He was 17 years old, the surviving male heir of an established dynasty, and he entered government with a crown strengthened by Henry VII's financial caution, dynastic diplomacy, and suppression of rival claims. Within weeks, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his elder brother Arthur, after the necessary papal dispensation had been obtained. The marriage joined the Tudors to the powerful Spanish monarchy and appeared to offer the dynasty everything it required: prestige, alliance, and the expectation of legitimate heirs. The young king cultivated a courtly image shaped by chivalry, ceremony, learning, music, hunting, tournaments, and military ambition. England entered wars against France and Scotland, and in 1513 English forces campaigned in France while an invading Scottish army under James IV was defeated at Flodden. Court politics revolved around access to the king and the influence of leading servants, most famously Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, whose long period of authority demonstrated that Tudor government depended not only on royal personality but also on experienced administrators, councils, clerks, judges, diplomats, bishops, and parliament. Yet beneath the ceremonies and foreign policy ambitions lay a problem that would eventually transform the monarchy itself. Catherine experienced several pregnancies, but only one child of the royal marriage survived infancy, Princess Mary, born in 1516. A daughter could inherit in principle, but 15th-century civil conflict had left English rulers acutely sensitive to disputed succession, and Henry increasingly sought the security of a legitimate male heir. By the 1520s, this concern had become inseparable from questions about the validity of his marriage. Henry argued that his union with Catherine had violated biblical prohibitions concerning marriage to a brother's widow, even though papal authority had previously allowed the marriage. Catherine rejected the claim that her first marriage to Arthur had been consummated, and she defended the legitimacy of her marriage to Henry and of their daughter Mary. What later became known as the King's Great Matter was therefore not simply a failed romance or a king changing wives. It involved canon law, scripture, papal authority, diplomatic pressure, dynastic inheritance, the position of Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine's nephew, and the wider struggle over who possessed jurisdiction in England. Anne Boleyn became central to this crisis because Henry wanted to marry her and because she represented the possibility of a new legitimate succession. Her political significance, however, extended beyond personal attraction. Members of the Boleyn circle were connected to reformist religious ideas, and Anne's position at court became tied to the growing argument that the king should not remain dependent on a papal judgment that might never arrive. When Wolsey failed to obtain the desired annulment, his political position collapsed. The failure did not immediately produce a complete religious revolution, but it opened space for a different strategy. During the years of the Reformation Parliament, beginning in 1529, statutes increasingly restricted papal authority and transferred powers once exercised through Rome into institutions controlled within the English realm. This transformation depended on Henry's determination, but it was not accomplished by solitary royal command. Lawyers, clerics, councillors, Parliament, Thomas Cranmer, and especially Thomas Cromwell helped convert dynastic objectives into legislation and administrative structures. The Act in Restraint of Appeals of 1533 declared that England was governed as an empire and sharply limited appeals from English ecclesiastical courts to Rome. The language was political and jurisdictional rather than a declaration that England had suddenly become a modern sovereign nation-state. By this stage Henry had secretly married. Anne Boleyn and Cranmer, now Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid under the developing royal legal framework. Anne was crowned queen, and in September 1533 she gave birth to Elizabeth. The child was healthy and legitimate under the new settlement, but she was another daughter rather than the male heir Henry expected. The following year, the Act of Supremacy of 1534 recognized the king as supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Ecclesiastical authority that had previously acknowledged papal jurisdiction was increasingly reorganized under the crown, and legal requirements of obedience made resistance potentially dangerous. The English Reformation was still developing, and doctrine did not instantly become fully Protestant. Henry remained theologically conservative in important respects even while dismantling papal jurisdiction. What changed decisively was the institutional location of authority. The crown now possessed powers over the church that no English king had exercised in the same form before. Thomas Cromwell became one of the central administrators of that transformation. Royal visitation of religious houses led into the dissolution of the monasteries, beginning with smaller houses in 1536 and expanding until monastic institutions across England and Wales had largely been suppressed by 1540. Their lands, valuables, income, and obligations passed initially to the crown, although much property was subsequently sold or granted to nobles, gentry, courtiers, and other purchasers. This generated major fiscal resources while also producing long-term changes in landholding and local patronage. It disrupted communities that had depended upon monasteries for worship, employment, charity, education, hospitality, and regional identity. The process cannot be reduced either to a purely financial seizure or to a purely religious reform. It was both, and it was also an administrative revolution in the relationship between crown, church property, and local society. Resistance became especially visible in the Pilgrimage of Grace of 1536, a large rising centered in northern England whose participants expressed religious, political, economic, and regional grievances. The government eventually reasserted control, but the rebellion demonstrated that royal supremacy and religious change could generate opposition on a scale that legislation alone could not dissolve. At approximately the same time, the Crown also reshaped its relationship with Wales. The Laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542 extended English legal and administrative structures more systematically into Wales, reorganised counties and courts, and provided Welsh representation in the English Parliament. These statutes brought Wales more closely under the institutional framework of the English Crown, but they did not create Britain. England and Wales remained under the Tudor monarchy while Scotland was a separate kingdom, and the political kingdom of Great Britain would not exist until 1707. The measures nevertheless mattered because they expanded the geographical and institutional reach of Tudor government and helped establish patterns of legal integration that would influence later British state formation. At court, meanwhile, the succession crisis remained unresolved. Anne Boleyn had not produced a surviving son. In 1536 she was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason-related offences. She was convicted and executed after proceedings whose fairness, evidence, and political context have been debated ever since. The formal charges belong to the historical record, but they should not automatically be treated as proof of private conduct simply because the Tudor state secured convictions. Historians continue to examine diplomatic reports, trial procedures, court faction, succession politics, and the interests of those around the king, and the surviving evidence does not establish every motive with certainty. Anne's death allowed Henry to marry Jane Seymour, and in October 1537 Jane gave birth to the long-awaited male heir, Edward. Jane died shortly afterward, leaving Edward as the central hope of dynastic continuity. Henry married 3 more times, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. These later marriages reflected different mixtures of diplomacy, court politics, personal preference, religion, and succession strategy, but the deeper issue remained unchanged. The monarchy's religious settlement and the dynasty's future had become inseparable. Parliament repeatedly altered the legal succession, defining the status of Henry's children and establishing arrangements for the crown after his death. By the final years of the reign, Edward stood first in the succession, followed by Mary and Elizabeth under statutory provisions despite earlier declarations affecting their legitimacy. The result was a monarchy transformed far beyond the one Henry had inherited in 1509. Royal authority over ecclesiastical jurisdiction had expanded dramatically. Parliament had become essential in legitimizing changes to church, succession, property, and constitutional practice. Monastic wealth had been redistributed. Wales had been integrated more closely into the English legal administrative system. Yet these gains in authority came with lasting instability. Religious allegiance had become a matter of politics as well as belief. Confiscated property created new interests that future rulers would have difficulty reversing. Court faction had become entangled with questions of doctrine and succession. The crown was stronger in institutional reach, but the realm was more deeply divided over what kind of church and monarchy it should possess. When Henry's reign finally approached its end, he could point to a male heir and a crown more powerful in ecclesiastical affairs than it had been 4 decades earlier. But the system he left behind also contained unresolved tensions that no statute could permanently settle, and those tensions would fall almost immediately upon the shoulders of the young Edward VI. By the final decade of Henry VIII's reign, the English monarchy had been transformed in ways that no single statute or marriage could fully explain. Royal supremacy over the church had expanded the crown's authority, monastic property had been redistributed on an enormous scale, Parliament had become deeply involved in defining religion and succession, and the machinery of government had grown more complex. Yet this transformation carried heavy costs. Henry's government continued to depend on taxation, loans, land sales, legal pressure, administrative innovation, and the cooperation of ministers and local officials. War remained one of the largest demands on royal resources. England fought renewed campaigns against France and Scotland during the 1540s, requiring troops, ships, fortifications, supply systems, and extraordinary revenue. Henry invested heavily in coastal defences and naval power, strengthening royal dockyards and expanding the number and importance of warships, but it would be misleading to describe him as the sole creator of a modern royal navy. English naval institutions had older foundations, and their development depended on generations of officers, shipwrights, merchants, administrators, and later rulers. The same caution applies to Tudor government more broadly. The crown became more administratively capable, but England did not suddenly become a modern bureaucratic state. Much authority still flowed through noble households, county officials, sheriffs, justices of the peace, courts, clergy, and personal networks of patronage. The expansion of central government therefore increased both capacity and pressure. Warfare pushed expenditure upward. Taxation became more demanding. The crown sold former monastic lands and other assets for revenue.
By this stroke,
the currency was repeatedly debased during the 1540s, reducing the precious metal content of coins and contributing to inflationary pressures already affected by wider economic change. These policies helped finance immediate needs, but they also transferred problems into the future. Political instability at court added another layer of uncertainty. Thomas More, who had served as Lord Chancellor, opposed the king's ecclesiastical supremacy and refused to accept the required legal position on royal authority over the church. He was convicted of treason and executed in 1535. His death later became central to competing Catholic and Protestant memories of the reign, but in contemporary political terms it reflected a government increasingly unwilling to tolerate resistance to the new constitutional religious settlement. Thomas Cromwell's fate showed that even the architects of reform were not secure. Cromwell had helped convert Henry's objectives into legislation, administrative systems, royal visitation, and financial institutions, yet his influence collapsed in 1540. The failure of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, court faction, foreign policy, religious disagreement, and rival political interests all contributed to his downfall, although historians continue to debate the relative weight of these factors. Cromwell was executed after attainder, demonstrating that Tudor political service offered power without guaranteeing survival. Catherine Howard, Henry's next queen, also fell from favor after accusations concerning her conduct before and during her marriage became politically explosive. Contemporary examinations and later legislation created a formal record, but the surviving evidence should not be converted into sensational certainty about every private detail. She was convicted under the Tudor legal framework and executed in 1542. Her case mattered not because it provides an intimate scandal for later storytelling, but because it revealed how royal marriage had become inseparable from succession, treason law, court rivalry, and the security of the monarchy itself. Through all of these crises, Henry's religious policy remained more complicated than a simple movement from Catholicism to Protestantism. The break with Rome had removed papal jurisdiction and placed ecclesiastical supremacy under the crown, but Henry retained many traditional theological commitments. The 10 Articles of 1536 introduced some reforming language while preserving substantial continuity. The Bishop's Book and later the King's Book reflected continuing disputes over doctrine. The Act of 6 Articles of 1539 reaffirmed conservative positions on issues including the Eucharist and clerical celibacy, and religious enforcement could fall on both reformers and traditionalists depending on the political moment. English Bibles became more accessible under royal authority, but unauthorized interpretation and radical doctrine remained dangerous. By the 1540s, different groups at court were competing over how far religious change should proceed, and Henry himself never embraced the fully Protestant theology that would emerge under his son. That ambiguity mattered because the succession now included 3 children associated with different religious and political possibilities. Edward, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, was the legitimate male heir and stood first. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had been declared illegitimate after the annulment of her parents' marriage but was restored to the line of succession by statute. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, occupied a similarly complicated position after her mother's fall. The Third Succession Act of 1543, commonly dated to the parliamentary session of 1543 to 1544, placed Mary and Elizabeth after Edward in the succession while leaving unresolved questions about their legitimacy under earlier legislation. Henry's final will and related arrangements sought to control the future order of inheritance, but the fact that Parliament and statute were repeatedly required to define succession showed how politically fragile dynastic continuity remained. When Henry died on January 28, 1547, the crown passed to his 9-year-old son. Edward VI inherited the royal supremacy, the expanded administrative structures of his father's reign, a depleted fiscal position, religious uncertainty, and a kingdom still adjusting to decades of institutional change. Because Edward was a child, government depended heavily on a regency-like council and leading political figures. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and the king's maternal uncle, emerged as Lord Protector. His government continued war with Scotland, pursued the policy later associated with the rough wooing, and moved religious reform in a more explicitly Protestant direction. Edward himself appears from surviving writings to have held serious Protestant convictions, but the policies of his reign cannot simply be treated as the personal commands of a child king. Bishops, councillors, reforming clergy, parliament, printers, and competing factions all shaped the new settlement. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer became particularly important in defining worship. The Book of Common Prayer of 1549 introduced a uniform English liturgy intended for use across the kingdom, replacing much of the traditional Latin service with a standardized vernacular form. The change was religious, administrative, and political at once. It also produced resistance. In Devon and Cornwall, opposition to the new prayer book combined with wider grievances and erupted into what became known as the Prayer Book Rebellion. The rebels demanded restoration of traditional forms of worship and challenged aspects of the government's religious program. In Norfolk, Kett's rebellion developed from a different mixture of grievances, particularly enclosure, land use, local economic pressures, and frustration with local elites. Although both uprisings occurred in 1549, they should not be merged into a single religious revolt. Their causes, leadership, demands, and regional contexts were distinct, and together they revealed how vulnerable the government could become when religious change interacted with economic and local tensions. Somerset's political position weakened during the crisis, and John Dudley, later Duke of Northumberland, eventually emerged as the dominant figure in government. Under Northumberland, the regime pursued financial stabilization and continued Protestant reform. The revised Book of Common Prayer of 1552 moved worship further in a reform direction, changing the language and theology of the communion service and stripping away additional traditional practices. The 42 Articles, prepared near the end of Edward's reign, also reflected the increasingly Protestant character of official doctrine, although their historical implementation was limited by the king's approaching death. By 1553, Edward's health was failing seriously. His illness created a problem that the Tudor monarchy had never fully escaped: who had the legitimate authority to determine succession when religion, statute, royal will, and bloodline pointed in competing directions. Under Henry VIII's statutory settlement, Mary stood next after Edward, followed by Elizabeth. But Mary's Catholic faith threatened to reverse the Protestant reforms made under Edward. During the final months of the king's life, a new succession plan was developed, commonly known as Edward's Devise for the Succession. Its evolving drafts sought to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth and redirect the crown through the descendants of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary Tudor, ultimately favoring Lady Jane Grey. Northumberland supported the plan, and Jane was married to his son Guilford Dudley, further complicating later interpretations of motive. It would be too simple, however, to describe the entire project as nothing more than Northumberland stealing a crown. Edward's own religious convictions, fears of Catholic restoration, legal arguments about legitimacy, factional interests, and the political survival of those who had governed in his name all intersected. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at 15 years old. His death was initially kept from broad public knowledge while the succession plan was put into motion. On July 10, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen in London. She possessed a dynastic connection to Henry VII through Mary Tudor, Queen of France, but the legal authority of the new arrangement was disputed, and the proclamation did not settle the country. Mary Tudor, now 37 years old, had already moved away from immediate danger and began appealing to nobles, local authorities, and subjects to recognize her right under her father's succession settlement. Support began gathering around her in East Anglia. Within days, England was confronting a question more fundamental than whether one claimant or another could occupy the throne. The crisis now tested whether succession would be determined by parliamentary statute, hereditary expectation, a dying king's device, council authority, religious allegiance, or the ability to command political support. The monarchy Henry VIII had made stronger in law had become dangerously uncertain in inheritance, and in July 1553 that contradiction was about to be decided in public. When Edward VI died in July 1553, the English succession did not simply divide the kingdom into Protestants supporting Lady Jane Grey and Catholics supporting Mary Tudor. The crisis was more complicated, because legitimacy, statute, royal authority, religion, regional loyalty, and political calculation all converged at once. Under the succession framework established during Henry VIII's reign, Mary stood next in line after Edward, followed by Elizabeth, even though both daughters had previously been declared illegitimate under earlier legislation. Edward's devise for the succession attempted to redirect the crown away from both of his half-sisters and toward Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his younger daughter Mary Tudor. Jane's claim therefore had dynastic foundations, but it conflicted with the expectations created by Henry VIII's statutory settlement and with the political assumption among many subjects that Mary remained the lawful heir. When Jane was proclaimed Queen on July 10, 1553, the government in London initially controlled the machinery of state, but control of the capital did not guarantee control of the kingdom. Mary had moved into East Anglia and began appealing to nobles, local officials, and communities to recognize her hereditary and statutory right. Support gathered rapidly. Some who joined her were committed Catholics, but others were motivated by dynastic legality, hostility toward the government dominated by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, local loyalties, political caution, or the belief that Edward's succession plan lacked sufficient authority. The speed with which Mary's support expanded demonstrated that Tudor legitimacy could not be created by proclamation alone. The Privy Council in London eventually abandoned Jane and recognized Mary. Northumberland's attempt to organize resistance collapsed, and he was arrested. Mary entered London as Queen with broad public celebration, presenting her accession as the restoration of lawful succession after an attempted displacement of the rightful heir. Religion mattered enormously, but in July 1553 Mary's victory was first and foremost a dynastic restoration. Northumberland was executed later that year after conviction for treason. Jane Grey remained in custody. Mary initially had reasons to avoid making Jane's punishment inevitable, because Jane could be understood as a young dynastic figure placed at the center of a plan developed by more powerful political actors. But that position became harder to sustain when rebellion placed Jane's existence back at the center of political danger. Mary's proposed marriage to Philip, son of Emperor Charles V and future King of Spain, provoked widespread anxiety. The marriage promised a powerful Catholic alliance and potentially strengthened Mary's international position, but opponents feared foreign influence, Habsburg entanglements, and the possibility that English policy might become subordinate to dynastic interests outside the kingdom. In early 1554, a series of planned uprisings developed, of which the rebellion led by Thomas Wyatt in Kent became the most serious. Wyatt's forces advanced toward London before the rising failed. The rebellion had mixed motives, including opposition to the Spanish marriage and fears concerning government policy, and it should not be reduced to a purely Protestant revolt. Yet because the conspirators sought political change and some intended to place Elizabeth in a more favorable succession position, the rebellion intensified the danger surrounding anyone who could serve as an alternative dynastic focus. Jane Grey and her husband Guilford Dudley were executed in February 1554. Their deaths should not be understood only through the later romantic image of an innocent young queen sacrificed by a cruel monarch. Jane had become, willingly or not, the living center of a rival claim already used once against Mary, and renewed rebellion made her continued existence politically dangerous in the judgment of the government. Mary's marriage to Philip proceeded in July 1554. Parliament established detailed conditions intended to protect English sovereignty, limiting Philip's independent authority and restricting the movement of English resources and offices. The marriage therefore reveals the same Tudor contradictions seen in earlier reigns. Royal marriage was intensely personal in dynastic form but constitutionally and diplomatically public in consequence. Mary hoped to produce an heir who would secure a Catholic succession, and surviving correspondence and court records show that expectations of pregnancy became politically significant. At more than one point, the court prepared for the possibility of a royal birth, but no child was born. The failure to produce an heir meant that Elizabeth remained increasingly important to the future of the dynasty despite continuing political distrust between the sisters. Meanwhile, Mary moved to reverse much of the religious direction established under Edward VI. The process was gradual and depended on Parliament. Early legislation repealed some Edwardian religious changes, while later parliamentary action restored papal jurisdiction. In 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole returned to England as papal legate, and Parliament formally reconciled the kingdom with Rome. Yet the restoration could not simply reverse every institutional transformation of Henry VIII's reign. Much former monastic property had passed into private hands, and attempting to confiscate all of it would have threatened powerful political interests. As a result, papal communion returned without restoring the pre-Reformation social and economic structure in full. The heresy laws were also revived, and from 1555 the government pursued Protestants who refused to conform to restored Catholic doctrine. A substantial number were executed for heresy during Mary's reign, including prominent figures such as Bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer. Their treatment later became central to Protestant historical memory, especially through John Fox's influential accounts. The later nickname, Bloody Mary, emerged from that confessional memory and should not be treated as a neutral contemporary description of the Queen. The persecutions were real and politically consequential, but historical analysis requires comparison rather than mythology. Religious coercion had existed under Henry VIII, Protestant governments under Edward VI also punished religious dissent, and Elizabethan England would later employ harsh legal measures against those regarded as political and religious threats. This comparison does not erase the severity of Marian persecution, it places it within a wider Tudor system in which rulers increasingly connected religious conformity with political obedience. Mary's government was therefore not defined by persecution alone. It also faced inherited financial problems, administrative demands, inflation, poor harvests, foreign policy pressures, and the continuing challenge of maintaining royal authority after decades of religious upheaval. The marriage to Philip also pulled England closer to Habsburg strategic interests. In 1557, England entered war against France. The conflict cannot be explained as simply Philip forcing England into a foreign war, because English councillors and the Crown had their own calculations, but the Habsburg alliance shaped the diplomatic context. In January 1558, French forces captured Calais, England's last significant territorial possession on the French mainland. The loss carried enormous symbolic weight because Calais had remained under English control for more than 2 centuries, and later narratives often treated its fall as the final humiliation of Mary's reign. Yet Calais alone did not destroy her government. The monarchy continued to function, parliament still operated, administration remained intact, and succession remained the more fundamental problem. Mary's health deteriorated during 1558, and the absence of an heir made Elizabeth's accession increasingly likely. Mary died on November 17, 1558, after a reign of just over 5 years. On the same day, Elizabeth became queen. She was 25 years old. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she inherited a disputed international legitimacy in Catholic eyes, because the papacy had never accepted the validity of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne. At home, however, Elizabeth's place in the succession had been recognized by Henry VIII's parliamentary settlement, and the transition occurred without the open dynastic struggle that had marked 1553. The new queen would become one of the most recognizable rulers in European history, but the surviving portraits that define her appearance must be treated as political objects as well as likenesses. Elizabethan portraiture increasingly used idealized features, elaborate clothing, jewels, symbols, globes, crowns, columns, flowers, and carefully controlled imagery to communicate authority, chastity, imperial aspiration, and permanence. These images provide essential visual evidence, but they are not photographic records of an unchanged face. The woman behind them inherited a kingdom carrying the accumulated consequences of every Tudor reign before hers. The crown possessed far greater ecclesiastical and administrative reach than it had under Henry VII. Parliament had repeatedly been used to define succession and religion. Wales had been integrated more closely into the English governmental system. Former monastic property had created powerful new landholding interests. Yet religious unity had fractured, foreign threats were serious, crown finances remained strained, and the relationship between Catholic Europe and a queen whose legitimacy Rome disputed was uncertain. Elizabeth inherited no simple political victory. She inherited a functioning Tudor state built through 70 years of consolidation, reform, coercion, legislation, and dynastic crisis, and her first challenge would be to decide which parts of that state could be preserved, which could be altered, and how a monarch without husband or heir could prevent another succession crisis from consuming the dynasty. Elizabeth I inherited the English throne in November 1558 at the age of 25, but she did not inherit a kingdom whose religious direction was settled. Within months, her government moved to redefine the relationship between crown and church through legislation that would shape the rest of her reign. The Act of Supremacy of 1559 restored royal authority over the English Church, using the title Supreme Governor rather than repeating Henry VIII's exact formulation of Supreme Head, while the Act of Uniformity established the use of a revised Book of Common Prayer and required attendance at authorized worship. These measures created a Protestant royal church, but they did not produce universal agreement or a perfectly balanced religious settlement accepted by everyone. Some former Catholics conformed outwardly while maintaining private attachments to older practices. Some Protestants believed the settlement did not go far enough. Bishops, clergy, magistrates, parish communities, and local officials interpreted and enforced policy with varying levels of enthusiasm. Religious conformity therefore developed unevenly across the kingdom, and enforcement changed as political circumstances became more dangerous. In the early years, Elizabeth's government generally prioritized outward obedience and political stability, but international conflict, papal hostility, missionary activity, and conspiracy fears gradually hardened the connection between religious dissent and questions of loyalty. This tension became especially dangerous because Elizabeth remained unmarried and had no child. The succession was never a private matter. It affected diplomacy, parliamentary debate, factional politics, and foreign calculations about the future of the English crown. Elizabeth negotiated seriously at different moments over possible marriages to English and foreign candidates, including Robert Dudley and later continental princes, but the process cannot be reduced to romance or personal reluctance. Marriage involved sovereignty, foreign alliances, religion, the possible political influence of a husband, and the risk of dividing the political nation around rival dynastic interests. Remaining unmarried protected Elizabeth from some of those dangers, but it preserved another: there was no direct Tudor heir. That uncertainty increased the significance of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Elizabeth's cousin and a granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII. As a Catholic with a strong dynastic claim through the Tudor bloodline, she could be viewed by some Catholics as an alternative heir, especially because Catholic powers disputed Elizabeth's legitimacy. Mary had ruled Scotland, married twice, and faced intense political conflict there before being forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James VI in 1567. In 1568 she fled into England seeking support. Her arrival created a problem that would last nearly 2 decades. Elizabeth could not simply ignore a fellow anointed queen, but releasing Mary created the possibility that she might become a focus for rebellion or foreign intervention. Holding her in England, however, ensured that every future conspiracy could be measured against her potential claim. The crisis intensified in 1569 with the Northern Rebellion, led by northern earls who opposed aspects of Elizabeth's government and sought changes with religious and dynastic implications. The rising failed, but it demonstrated that Catholic discontent, regional noble power, and succession politics could combine in dangerous ways. It would be wrong to conclude from this that English Catholics as a whole supported rebellion. Many remained loyal to Elizabeth despite religious disagreement, and political identity did not always follow confessional lines. Yet after the rebellion, the government had stronger reasons to treat certain forms of Catholic political organization as a security threat. The situation changed further in 1570 when Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her deprived of her claimed title. Whatever the practical impact on individual Catholics, the excommunication made the government more suspicious that religious loyalty could conflict with political obedience. From this point onward, Catholic recusancy, missionary activity, foreign invasion plans, and dynastic plots increasingly became intertwined in official thinking. Elizabeth relied heavily on experienced ministers to manage these risks. William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, served as one of the central figures of her government, combining administrative skill, parliamentary experience, diplomatic judgment, and a strong interest in political security. Francis Walsingham became particularly important in foreign intelligence and the detection of conspiracies. Under men such as Cecil and Walsingham, the government developed systems of surveillance that included intercepted correspondence, informants, diplomatic reporting, agents abroad, code-breaking, and careful monitoring of suspected networks. These practices were sophisticated by 16th-century standards, but they should not be described as an all-seeing modern intelligence service. Messages could be misunderstood, agents could exaggerate, informants could have mixed motives, and intercepted correspondence rarely explained an entire conspiracy by itself. Intelligence had to be interpreted, and interpretation could be shaped by fear, politics, and incomplete evidence. The Ridolfi plot of the early 1570s illustrated the scale of the threat officials believed they faced. Roberto Ridolfi, an Italian banker, became associated with plans involving foreign support, Mary Queen of Scots, and the possibility of replacing Elizabeth. The plot did not produce the invasion or regime change envisioned by its participants, but it reinforced government suspicions about the connection between Mary's presence and international Catholic politics. More than a decade later, the Throckmorton plot of the early 1580s involved another network connected to plans for foreign intervention and support for Mary. Francis Throckmorton's correspondence and contacts contributed to the government's case that conspiracy could operate through diplomatic and religious channels rather than open rebellion alone. The discovery of such plots encouraged Parliament and the Crown to strengthen legislation aimed at protecting Elizabeth and controlling those considered dangerous to the state. The pressure eventually culminated in the Babington Plot of 1586. Anthony Babington and a group of associates became involved in a conspiracy that contemplated foreign intervention, Mary's release, and the removal of Elizabeth. Walsingham's intelligence system penetrated the correspondence network, and messages associated with Mary were intercepted and deciphered. The surviving material became central to the case against her, but the evidentiary process remains an area where careful language matters. Historians continue to examine the handling of the correspondence, the role of intermediaries, and the degree to which the government allowed the plot to develop before acting. What is clear is that Mary was brought to trial at Fotheringhay Castle in October 1586, accused of involvement in a conspiracy against Elizabeth. She rejected the authority of the court over an anointed foreign queen, but she was convicted. Parliament pressed for execution, and Elizabeth faced a decision with implications far beyond one prisoner. Executing Mary could remove a dynastic rival but also establish a dangerous precedent: 1. Queen authorizing the death of another. It could provoke foreign retaliation, deepen confessional hostility, and alter the succession problem rather than solve it. Elizabeth eventually signed the warrant. Mary was executed in February 1587. The aftermath revealed the ambiguity surrounding responsibility. Elizabeth expressed anger over the way the warrant had been carried out and blamed officials for proceeding without further authorization, while historians have long debated how much of this response reflected genuine hesitation, political self-protection, or both. The surviving correspondence does not justify a simple claim that Elizabeth eagerly welcomed Mary's death. The episode instead shows the limits of Tudor monarchy under pressure. The crown possessed enormous authority, but decisions could become entangled with councils, parliament, secretaries, legal process, and the need to manage public responsibility. Throughout these decades, Elizabeth worked carefully to sustain royal authority in a political culture that assumed rulers, soldiers, councillors, and household heads were normally male. Her gender made royal representation especially important. Progresses through the kingdom brought the queen physically into contact with subjects and local elites. Court ceremony emphasized hierarchy and access. Speeches presented her as monarch, defender of the realm, and political judge. Portraiture became increasingly symbolic, using clothing, jewels, crowns, columns, globes, suns, pearls, and other visual devices to communicate legitimacy, chastity, stability, and command. These images were political constructions as much as personal likenesses, and they became more idealized as Elizabeth aged. The Queen's unmarried status was transformed from a dynastic weakness into part of a carefully managed public identity, yet no amount of symbolism could eliminate the succession question. Parliament periodically pressed her to marry or designate an heir, and Elizabeth resisted allowing succession debate to define her authority while she still lived. At the same time, religious conflict became increasingly international. English support for Protestant forces in the Netherlands, maritime attacks on Spanish interests, the activities of privateers such as Francis Drake, tensions over trade, and Spain's support for Catholic causes steadily damaged relations with Philip II. Mary Queen of Scots' execution removed one claimant but intensified the wider confrontation. By the late 1580s, England and Spain were no longer simply competing through diplomacy, religion, and indirect intervention. They were moving toward open war. The political survival of Elizabeth's monarchy, the defense of the Protestant settlement, the future of English maritime strategy, and the balance of power in Europe were now converging into a single military crisis. In 1588, the Tudor crown would face the most famous external threat of Elizabeth's reign, and the outcome would become one of the most powerful legends ever attached to her rule. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth I's government had survived dynastic conspiracy, religious division, and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, but the political struggle that had developed around those crises was now merging with an international war. Relations between England and Spain had deteriorated over many years rather than collapsing suddenly in 1588. English merchants and privateers had attacked Spanish shipping and colonial commerce, sometimes with varying degrees of royal approval, while Elizabeth supported Protestant resistance against Spanish power in the Netherlands. Philip II viewed English intervention, maritime attacks, and the increasingly Protestant character of Elizabeth's regime as interconnected threats. By 1585, England and Spain were effectively at war. Francis Drake became one of the most prominent English maritime commanders, striking Spanish interests in the Atlantic and Caribbean and attacking shipping and ports, but neither Drake nor any single captain created England's naval strength alone. The crown depended on royal ships, privately owned vessels, experienced seamen, dockyards, supply systems, coastal defenses, financiers, merchants, and administrators whose combined efforts made sustained maritime operations possible. Spain's planned invasion of England in 1588 was equally complex. Philip II intended the Armada to sail through the English Channel, establish control long enough to coordinate with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and support an invasion across the Channel. The plan required communication between forces operating from different bases, secure transport, favorable conditions, and the ability to protect the invasion route against English interference. When the Spanish fleet entered the Channel in the summer of 1588, English naval forces under Lord Howard of Effingham, supported by commanders including Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, shadowed and engaged it through a series of actions. English ships generally emphasized mobility and long-range gunnery rather than attempting to reproduce the close combat methods of earlier naval warfare, although tactical realities varied from engagement to engagement. The Spanish Armada retained formation through much of the Channel Passage and reached waters near Calais, but coordination with Parma's army proved extremely difficult. English fireships sent toward the anchored Spanish fleet contributed to the disruption of its formation, and the subsequent Battle of Gravelines placed the Armada under intense pressure. Spanish commanders then faced the problem of returning home because a direct route back through the Channel was no longer practical. The fleet sailed north around Scotland and Ireland, where severe weather, navigation difficulties, damaged ships, limited supplies, and dangerous coastlines added heavily to its losses. Later English national memory often turned the campaign into a simple story in which Protestant England was saved by a miraculous storm, but the surviving evidence presents a more complicated result. English naval pressure mattered. Spanish operational planning and logistical difficulties mattered. Communication failures mattered. Weather mattered greatly during the return voyage. None of these factors alone explains the outcome. Nor did the campaign permanently destroy Spanish naval power. Spain rebuilt fleets, continued fighting, and remained a major European and maritime power long after 1588. For Elizabeth, however, the Armada crisis offered an extraordinary political opportunity. During the invasion threat, she visited troops assembled at Tilbury. A famous speech tradition associated with that appearance later became central to her public image, presenting the Queen as sharing the danger of her subjects while asserting royal courage and command. The general episode is well established, but the exact wording transmitted in later versions should be treated cautiously because surviving texts were recorded and circulated through complicated documentary traditions rather than preserved as a modern verbatim recording. What mattered politically was the image. A female monarch whose enemies questioned her legitimacy appeared before military forces at a moment of national danger and emerged from the crisis with enhanced prestige. Portraiture, sermons, printed accounts, commemorations, and later histories transformed 1588 into one of the defining moments of Elizabethan rule. Yet the war did not end with the Armada. English expeditions against Spain could fail as dramatically as Spanish operations had failed against England. Campaigns required enormous expenditure, and the long Anglo-Spanish War strained royal finances for the remainder of Elizabeth's reign. Maritime expansion continued nonetheless. Drake's voyages, Walter Raleigh's sponsorship of Atlantic ventures, and the activities of merchants, private investors, navigators, and privateers extended English commercial and geographic ambitions. Attempts to establish colonies in North America included the Roanoke ventures of the 1580s, whose settlements failed to produce a permanent English colony and whose final fate remains partly uncertain. These failures are important because later imperial history can make early Elizabethan expansion appear more inevitable than it was. England did not yet possess a mature overseas empire, and no British Empire existed. Maritime ventures were experimental, costly, dangerous, and often unsuccessful. Trade networks nevertheless widened. In 1600, Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, later known as the East India Company. Its creation marked an important development in English long-distance commercial organization, but it did not instantly create territorial empire in Asia or establish the later imperial system that would emerge over generations. At home, the cultural reputation of the period grew alongside these political and maritime developments. London's commercial theatre expanded, print circulation increased, and writers including William Shakespeare worked within an increasingly dynamic literary environment. Court entertainments, poetry, music, architecture, portraiture, and public ceremony contributed to the image later remembered as an Elizabethan Golden Age. But that phrase can conceal the uneven realities of life across the kingdom. Population growth and inflation placed pressure on wages and living standards. Poor harvests during the 1590s intensified hardship in some regions. Enclosure disputes and changing patterns of land use generated local tension. Authorities worried about vagrancy, unemployment, migration, and the ability of parishes to support the poor. The Poor Laws of 1598 and 1601 developed a more systematic framework of parish responsibility for relief, distinguishing between categories of need and creating administrative obligations that would influence English social policy long after Elizabeth's death. These measures reflected governmental capacity, but they also reveal the scale of social pressure beneath the celebratory image of the age. The limits of Tudor state-building were even more visible in Ireland. English monarchs had claimed authority there for centuries, but actual control varied dramatically by region, and Tudor efforts to extend centralized rule encountered different political traditions, local lordships, religious divisions, and resistance. During the 1590s, the 9 Years' War became one of the most expensive and difficult conflicts of Elizabeth's reign. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and his allies challenged English expansion in Ireland and sought external support, while the Crown committed increasing military and financial resources to suppress the rebellion. The conflict should not be treated as a side story to English national triumph. It exposed the coercive limits of Tudor government, the difficulty of imposing centralized authority across culturally and politically distinct territories, and the growing connection between religion, regional power, and international rivalry. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was sent to Ireland in 1599 with a major command but returned to England without authorization after an unsuccessful campaign. His political position deteriorated rapidly. In February 1601, Essex and a group of followers attempted a rebellion in London that failed to attract the support they expected. Essex was convicted of treason and executed. The episode became another example of the dangerous relationship between royal favor, faction, ambition, and political survival at the Tudor court, but it did not produce the collapse of Elizabeth's government. By then, however, the Queen was aging, the war with Spain remained unresolved, Ireland continued to consume resources, and Crown finances were under sustained pressure. Elizabeth had ruled for more than 4 decades without marrying and without producing a direct heir. The succession question that had shaped Tudor politics since the dynasty's beginning could no longer remain indefinitely in the background. Courtiers and councillors increasingly recognized the political importance of James VI of Scotland, whose descent from Henry VII's daughter Margaret Tudor gave him the strongest practical dynastic claim. No public settlement could be handled casually while Elizabeth remained alive, but behind the visible ceremonies of the final Tudor court, political attention was already beginning to shift northward. The monarchy had survived invasion, conspiracy, rebellion, religious division, and war, yet its future now depended on a successor who was not a Tudor at all. By the opening years of the 17th century, Elizabeth I had become more than a reigning monarch. She had become the visible center of a political system that had learned to survive religious division, war, rebellion, fiscal strain, and the absence of a direct heir. Yet the very problem that had shadowed the Tudor dynasty from its beginning now returned with growing urgency. Elizabeth had never publicly named a successor with complete and final clarity. That ambiguity gave her political flexibility while she lived. It discouraged powerful subjects from organizing openly around a future monarch and prevented the court from becoming divided too early between competing succession factions. But it also meant that, as her health declined, senior counselors had to manage a transition whose success depended on preparation, discretion, and a claimant capable of commanding broad recognition. By this stage, James VI of Scotland had emerged as the strongest practical successor. His claim descended through Margaret Tudor, eldest daughter of Henry VII, who had married James IV of Scotland in 1503. That marriage, arranged a century earlier as part of Tudor diplomacy, had created a dynastic connection that now offered a solution to the succession crisis Elizabeth had never resolved through marriage or children of her own. Robert Cecil, son of William Cecil and one of the most important ministers of Elizabeth's final years, maintained careful political contacts that helped facilitate the transition. Surviving correspondence shows that communication with James and his circle developed before Elizabeth's death, but the process should not be turned into a theatrical secret conspiracy or a simple claim that Cecil alone chose the next king. The succession depended on dynastic expectation, political calculation, the acceptance of counselors and elites, and James's ability to present himself as a lawful and stable successor. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, ending more than 44 years of rule and more than a century of Tudor monarchy. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England, and the transition occurred without the kind of open dynastic war that had created the Tudor dynasty at Bosworth. That peaceful transfer was historically significant, but it must be described precisely. James now wore the crowns of both England and Scotland, creating what historians usually call the Union of the Crowns. The two kingdoms shared one monarch, but they did not become one legally unified state. England and Scotland retained separate parliaments. Legal systems, churches, institutions, and political identities. The Kingdom of Great Britain would not be created until the Acts of Union took effect in 1707. The succession of 1603 therefore did not complete British political union. It connected the monarchies and changed the framework within which future rulers would attempt to manage the relationship between the two kingdoms. Seen from that moment, the Tudor century had been filled with enough conflict to justify the language of blood and betrayal, but only if those words are treated as historical shorthand rather than a complete explanation. The dynasty began with the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and seized the crown in 1485. Henry VII then faced challenges from Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, used attainders, bonds, recognizances, councils, parliament, diplomacy, and dynastic marriage to secure his position, and built a stronger monarchy on foundations that remained dependent on cooperation from nobles and local government. Under Henry VIII, marriage and succession became matters of state survival. Catherine of Aragon's failure to produce a surviving son, Henry's attempt to obtain an annulment, Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, and the king's later marriages turned the royal household into a place where private dynastic problems could produce constitutional consequences. Executions of ministers, nobles, religious opponents, and queens became part of the political landscape. Religious change created new forms of persecution, while rebellions such as the Pilgrimage of Grace demonstrated that royal authority could provoke mass resistance. Edward VI's short reign brought more explicitly Protestant reform and ended with a disputed attempt to redirect the succession toward Lady Jane Grey. Mary I recovered the throne through dynastic and political support, restored papal communion, confronted Wyatt's rebellion, and revived heresy prosecutions. Elizabeth's reign brought plots, intelligence operations, the prolonged confinement and eventual execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, war with Spain, rebellion in Ireland, and the Essex Revolt. These episodes were real and consequential. Yet, treating Tudor government as an endless sequence of executions and conspiracies would distort how monarchy actually functioned. Most political life occurred through royal councils, courts, parliament, parish institutions, taxation, diplomacy, legal administration, household government, local officeholding, patronage, negotiation, and written orders. The spectacular moments survive most vividly because they were dramatic, but the durability of Tudor rule depended far more on institutions and networks that operated every day. The same distinction is essential when explaining how the Tudor monarchy helped shape later Britain. Henry VII did not create a modern British state. His achievement was narrower but fundamental. He stabilized a contested English crown after decades of dynastic conflict and made the new royal house politically durable. Henry VIII produced a far more disruptive institutional transformation. His break with papal jurisdiction changed the relationship between monarchy and church, expanded royal authority, and made Parliament central to major constitutional and religious legislation. The Act in Restraint of Appeals and the Act of Supremacy did not create modern sovereignty in a single moment, but they altered the legal language through which the English crown understood its jurisdiction. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed land and wealth on a scale that created new political interests and made later restoration far more difficult. The laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542 brought Wales more closely into the legal and administrative framework of the English crown and gave Welsh counties representation in the English Parliament. This was not the creation of Britain, but it was a major step in integrating territory under the English monarchy. The Reformation also changed the role of Parliament itself. Successive Tudor governments used statute to define church authority, succession, treason, worship, and royal jurisdiction. Parliament did not become sovereign in the later constitutional sense, and Tudor monarchs did not intend to create parliamentary democracy. But the repeated use of legislation for fundamental changes established precedents that later generations would use in conflicts over the powers of crown and parliament. Henry VIII therefore stands as the central visual symbol of institutional rupture, a monarch remembered for personal power whose reign actually depended on legislation, ministers, clerics, administrators, lawyers, and political negotiation to convert royal objectives into durable structures. Elizabeth stands at the other end of that transformation as the central visual symbol of consolidation and transition. Her government restored a Protestant royal church in 1559, defended the regime against domestic and international threats, expanded maritime capacity, developed sophisticated intelligence networks, and preserved monarchical authority through more than 4 decades without solving the succession through marriage. Under her, royal image became a political instrument of exceptional sophistication. Portraits presented a queen untouched by age, ceremony turned unmarried status into symbolic strength, and the idea of the Virgin Queen gradually became part of a larger mythology of national stability. Yet the historical Elizabeth remained a ruler operating through councillors, parliament, financial constraints, local administration, and uncertain information. She did not know that later generations would use her reign as a founding story for British maritime greatness. Nor could Henry VIII have foreseen that his break with Rome would become part of later arguments about national identity and constitutional sovereignty. Much of what is remembered about the Tudors has been compressed into personalities. Henry VIII becomes the king with 6 wives. Mary becomes Bloody Mary. Elizabeth becomes the Virgin Queen. The Armada becomes a single moment in which a small England supposedly destroyed Spanish naval power. Tudor court politics becomes an endless sequence of betrayal. These images survive because they are memorable, but they often conceal structural history. Henry's marriages mattered because succession, religion, foreign policy, and law were connected. Marian persecution mattered, but so did confessional coercion under other Tudor governments. Elizabeth's unmarried status mattered because it shaped diplomacy and succession, not simply because of personal preference. The Armada mattered because England survived a major invasion threat, but Spain remained a formidable power and the war continued. Court betrayal mattered, but so did the institutional rules that made royal favor politically valuable and dangerous. By 1603, the monarchy had changed profoundly from the one Henry VII seized in 1485. The crown controlled a national church. Parliament had participated in repeated constitutional transformations. Wales had been integrated more closely into English governance. Maritime warfare and commerce occupied a larger strategic place. England had become more deeply involved in Atlantic ventures and European confessional politics. At the same time, the Tudor period had left unresolved religious divisions, financial weaknesses, tensions in Ireland, uncertainty over the limits of royal power, and an increasingly important relationship between Crown and Parliament. The dynasty ended peacefully at the precise point of succession, even though it had been born in civil war. James VI of Scotland became James I of England without another Bosworth, but he inherited not a finished Britain, only a transformed set of kingdoms and institutions. The Tudors had helped reshape the political landscape in which later British Union would become possible, while also passing forward conflicts that would define the Stuart century. Their line was extinct, but the constitutional, religious, territorial, and dynastic questions they had intensified were only beginning to enter a new phase. When James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England in 1603, Tudor rule ended, but the political world shaped by the Tudors did not disappear with Elizabeth I. The new king inherited institutions, laws, religious divisions, administrative practices, territorial relationships, and political expectations that had been transformed repeatedly since Henry Tudor crossed the battlefield at Bosworth in 1485. The dynasty had lasted little more than a century, yet during that period the English monarchy had changed its relationship with the Church, Parliament, Wales, local government, foreign powers, maritime commerce, and the very idea of royal authority. James inherited 2 crowns, not a united British kingdom, and he inherited problems that no Tudor ruler had permanently solved. To understand what survived them, it is necessary to look beyond the most famous executions, marriages, rebellions, and battles and examine the systems through which Tudor monarchy actually functioned. Henry VII began with the most basic problem of all, legitimacy. His victory over Richard III gave him possession of the crown, but possession did not guarantee acceptance. He secured his position through marriage to Elizabeth of York, parliamentary recognition, diplomacy, financial management, law, bonds, recognizances, royal councils, and the containment of rival claimants. His government depended on coercion when necessary, but it also depended on negotiation with nobles, gentry, parliament, and local officeholders. The monarchy he passed to Henry VIII was more secure than the one he had seized, yet its future still depended on dynastic fertility. That dependence became one of the central forces of the next reign. Henry VIII's search for a secure male succession eventually collided with papal jurisdiction and helped produce one of the deepest institutional ruptures in English history. The break with Rome transferred ecclesiastical authority toward the crown, while Parliament became an essential instrument for defining that change through statute. Royal supremacy did not instantly make England fully Protestant, and Henry himself retained many traditional theological beliefs, but the legal relationship between monarchy and church had been fundamentally altered. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed religious wealth and land, strengthened new political interests, disrupted local religious and charitable institutions, and increased the crown's immediate resources while creating consequences that later rulers could not easily reverse. Royal power became more expansive, but it also became more coercive and more dependent on administrative machinery capable of enforcing religious and political conformity. Edward VI inherited this transformed monarchy as a child. Under his governments, Protestant reform moved more decisively into doctrine and worship through the Book of Common Prayer and related measures. Yet policy was not simply the expression of a young king's personal conviction. Councils, bishops, parliament, political factions, and ministers shaped the direction of government. The succession crisis that followed Edward's illness demonstrated again that law, bloodline, religion, and political support could point in different directions. Lady Jane Grey's brief proclamation as Queen could not overcome Mary Tudor's stronger combination of hereditary expectation, statutory position, and political backing. Mary I restored Catholic worship and papal communion, but she could not restore the entire pre-Reformation order. Former monastic property remained largely beyond recovery, and the institutional changes of Henry VIII's reign had already altered the political landscape. Her government used religious persecution in an attempt to enforce restored orthodoxy, while her marriage to Philip of Spain and repeated hopes for an heir made succession an international as well as domestic issue. When no surviving heir emerged, the crown passed to Elizabeth. Elizabeth I restored Protestant royal supremacy in 1559 and spent the next 4 decades managing the consequences of a religious settlement that was never universally accepted. Her reign demonstrates how gender, legitimacy, religious identity, propaganda, and political survival could become inseparable. As an unmarried female monarch in a political culture shaped by patriarchal assumptions, Elizabeth used progresses, speeches, portraiture, ceremony, and carefully constructed royal imagery to reinforce authority. Yet image was not government. Her regime depended on councillors such as William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, on parliament, courts, local magistrates, parish administration, taxation, diplomacy, and increasingly sophisticated intelligence practices. Surveillance, intercepted correspondence, diplomatic agents, informants, and code-breaking helped the government confront conspiracy, but intelligence was never perfect. The Ridolfi, Throckmorton, and Babington plots demonstrate both the seriousness of certain threats and the danger of assuming that every Catholic subject was disloyal or that every intercepted message revealed an entire conspiracy beyond doubt. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Spanish Armada campaign, the 9 Years' War in Ireland, and the Essex Rebellion later became dramatic landmarks in Elizabethan memory, but none can be understood outside broader structures. War with Spain involved maritime strategy, religion, privateering, European alliances, logistics, finance, and weather. Tudor expansion in Ireland exposed the limits of centralized royal authority and generated conflicts that cannot be reduced to English national achievement. Maritime ventures under figures such as Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh expanded English ambitions, but they did not create a fully formed British Empire. The East India Company Charter of 1600 opened another commercial pathway whose later importance should not be projected backward into Elizabeth's intentions. At the same time, inflation, harvest problems, poverty, enclosure disputes, and concerns about vagrancy complicated the idea of a universal Golden Age. The Poor Laws of 1598 and 1601 reveal a government responding to persistent social pressures rather than presiding over uninterrupted prosperity. Reconstructing this century requires constant source criticism. Parliamentary statutes reveal what governments legally enacted, but not automatically how every subject experienced those laws. Privy Council records show administrative concerns and official decisions, but they preserve the perspective of government. State papers and diplomatic dispatches provide invaluable evidence about foreign policy and court politics, yet ambassadors could misunderstand events, repeat rumors, or write for audiences with their own priorities. Legal proceedings establish formal accusations and judgments, but a conviction does not automatically prove every allegation as private historical truth. Financial accounts reveal the movement of money and resources, while letters provide personal perspectives that remain selective and situational. Chronicles preserve contemporary and near-contemporary narratives but often reflect political, religious, or literary agendas. Later memoir-like stories can preserve useful traditions while also transforming uncertain details into memorable anecdotes. No single category of evidence should control the entire interpretation. Portraits demand similar caution. The commanding Henry VIII associated with Hans Holbein the Younger, and the increasingly idealized Elizabeth of later court portraiture, tell historians how monarchy wished to be represented as well as something about appearance. Clothing, posture, jewels, crowns, columns, globes, inscriptions, and controlled facial presentation communicated authority and political identity. They cannot be read as photographs of what a ruler looked or felt like at an exact moment. The same problem affects historical memory more broadly. Henry VIII becomes 6 wives. Mary becomes Bloody Mary. Elizabeth becomes the Virgin Queen. The Armada becomes a miraculous national victory. Court politics becomes betrayal. These shorthand images contain fragments of historical reality, but they compress institutions and structural forces into personalities. Blood and betrayal were undeniably present across the Tudor century. Bosworth, rebellions, attainders, executions, succession crises, religious persecution, conspiracies, and factional conflict were real. Yet most days of Tudor government were conducted through councils, courts, law, taxation, petitions, local administration, diplomacy, household management, patronage, and negotiation. Likewise, describing the Tudors as helping to forge Britain captures an important direction of change only if the phrase is defined carefully. Henry VII stabilized the English crown. Henry VIII transformed church-state relations and expanded the legislative role of Parliament in constitutional change. The Laws in Wales Acts brought Wales more closely into English law and parliamentary representation. Elizabeth consolidated Protestant monarchy, expanded maritime capacity, and ended her reign with a succession that placed the same monarch over England and Scotland. None of this created the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The Tudors ruled England and Wales, while Scotland remained a separate kingdom, and political union would not occur until 1707. Nor could Tudor rulers foresee later civil wars, union, or empire. Their decisions belonged to the problems of their own age. Their enduring importance lies elsewhere. A dynasty born from a contested battlefield victory transformed the relationship between crown, church, parliament, territory, law, and political identity so deeply that the ruler who inherited England in 1603 received a fundamentally different state from the one Henry VII had seized in 1485. The Tudor line was gone, but the structures, conflicts, and questions it had intensified remained. Britain itself would emerge only through further struggles, negotiations, and unions long after the last Tudor had left the throne.